Hello, Brian.
Hi, Robin.
I'm Robin. I'm Robin Hanson, economist here at George Mason University, and you are?
I'm Brian Christian, author of the new book, The Most Human Human: What Talking with Computers Teaches Us About What It Means to Be Alive.
And I'm holding mine up to the camera, so they all know what they're looking for.
Okay, I've got the book in the camera.
There you go. So, Brian, would you like to start us off with the quick synopsis of the book?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's your thesis?
So the book really tells, I think, two stories. One is this kind of broad theoretical story, and the other is this personal narrative story. So the broad theoretical story is that I'm really interested in how the computer in the late 20th century and the early 21st century fits into this really long, ancient philosophical question, which is going back all the way to Aristotle. We've been asking this question of what is it that makes humans different and special and unique? And typically we've tried to answer that question by looking at the animal kingdom. So what are the abilities that animals have, and what is it that we can do that they can't do? And we've typically prized and cultivated those abilities in particular. And so what I find really riveting from a philosophical perspective about the computer is that our benchmark for how we're measuring ourselves has really changed. So in the 21st century, we're much more preoccupied with what is the human experience and in terms of its relationship to machines rather than its relationship to animals. So there's this really, I think, grand pivoting of this ancient question. And it's giving us some new answers, which I think is really, really exciting. The personal narrative story of the book is the story of my participation in the 2009 Loebner Prize, which is an annual Turing test held by the AI community. So the idea of the Turing test comes from a 1950 paper by Alan Turing, where even as the computer is really still in its infancy, he's asking these really long-term philosophical questions like, can machines think? Could we someday build a machine that could think? And if there were someday such a machine, how would we know? And Turing famously constructs this idea of the Turing test, which is that you assemble this panel of scientists, and they're having these 5-minute-long chat conversations, sending text messages back and forth. What they don't know is, are the messages they're receiving coming from a real person, or are they coming from a computer program that's designed to pretend that it's a person by mimicking human conversation? So it's up to these judges in 5 minutes of conversation to steer it in a way that allows them to make that judgment. And if they can't, then the computers effectively win. And Turing says we'll reach a point where machines are fooling us about 30% of the time, and as a result, we generally consider them to be intelligent. So the famous mark that Turing had set was that we would hit 30% by the year 2000, which did not come to pass. But in the year 2008, the machines came up shy of that mark by just one vote. They managed to fool 25% of the judges. And so I ended up becoming involved in the 2009 competition as one of the human, they're called confederates, so the real people talking to the judges, trying to persuade the judges that we are, in fact, human. So I was part of the human defense, if you will, trying to kind of prevent them from crossing this threshold. And so that gave me a very direct and personal, vantage point into these questions of what does it mean to act human? Because here I am, I've got to kind of represent my species at this competition several months from now. So what am I going to do? And that's part of what leads to this investigation of what are the things that make the human experience, and specifically human communication, so unique.
So I should say to all our listeners that I enjoyed the book, and like the best popular books, it's chock full of lots of interesting detail and lots of riffs on various related topics. But let's bring back to the main thesis here. So,
Yeah.
so certainly it's obvious that we compare ourselves to things, and we compare ourselves to whatever is in our pantheon of objects, our animals or angels or gods or rocks, and obviously now computers.
Mm-hmm.
But you go beyond merely observing that there are a variety of things we can compare ourselves to. You seem to advocate. I guess the way I put your thesis the strongest, at least the way I read it, was that you suggest that we try to live our lives as if we were trying to make it hard for machines to mimic us.
I think that, to some extent, I think, yes, that is right. So you're saying why try to do that versus try to live our lives as though we're not, apes or something?
Well, there's several related questions. One is, should we be taking this computer comparison more seriously than any of the other previous comparisons? One might have once tried to live your life so that you weren't confused with an angel, or tried to live your life so you weren't confused with those jungle folk who were uncivilized, or you might have tried to live your life so you weren't confused with a woman. And why should we now especially take this new comparison seriously as something to try? And then secondly, why should we be trying to live our lives in order to distinguish ourselves from anything out there, as opposed to just having other reasons to live our lives?
Yeah. Well, so in your second question, there's sort of the this notion of why don't you just be yourself, basically, right? Which, in fact, was precisely what the organizers of the Turing test said to me was, there's nothing in particular you have to do, just go and be yourself. I think what's interesting, I think that there is a difference in the sense that John Searle has this critique of sort of what he sees as the hubbub around computers, that he says we've always had these different metaphors for the way that the mind works. We currently think it works like a computer. We used to think it worked more like a telephone switchboard. And in fact, it's very amusing to go back and read these 19th century and 18th century texts where they describe the mind as like a kind of system of pneumatic steam valves. So we've always had technical models or metaphors for what the brain is all about. What I see as being really distinct about the computer in particular, and what distinguishes it also from the animal kingdom, is that we've, especially in the last 4 or 5 decades, really deliberately modeled the computer after ourselves. So when we've designed these so-called expert systems, we would do it by extensively interviewing human experts at certain tasks, getting them to break down their thought process, and then representing that thought process in software. So part of what I think is going on that's really unique with AI is that it is a very concrete representation of what we understand about ourselves. That it's not merely this thing, but it's this thing that's very consciously designed as an approximation of us. And
so that makes it all the more odd as a thing to try to be different from. So you could say you should try not to be like an animal because you aren't an animal, you're a human, and you should try to be like the human you are. And if you say, well, we tried to make these machines as best we could to be like humans, and they aren't exactly like humans, but they were our best shot, and now you should try to be different from them because, well, they aren't exactly like us. It's an odd sort of motivation.
Yes, I see your point. I think to some extent, I think of it something like if we were a circle and we invent an octagon, then we become really invested in those tiny arcs, from point to point.
Right.
So I think part of it is that what I find invigorating about science and philosophy is the idea that we have not fully plumbed ourselves, basically. That we have not fully fathomed what we're all about, how we function. And so I think part of the, I guess, thrill or joy for me at trying to deliberately go in and break, in the case of my book, these chatbot programs, part of the thrill is trying to prove that there really is an arc from point to point rather than a straight line. So trying to prove that our approximation was only an approximation, that we haven't nailed it yet. There's still something to be learned. So I think that for me is part of it. Trying to prove that the approximations aren't good enough,
So there's certainly the fact that when we created something that was more like us than other things around, it gave us a closer measure to see what we actually are.
Yeah.
Than other things had. So we can see more clearly what we are and what we aren't by having a closer comparison.
Yeah.
That's certainly useful for learning about who we are. But going further and then saying, then you should live your life to try to be different from those things, seems like it's going quite a few more steps farther. I'd like to just go through a list for their listeners or viewers of a long number of things that sort of are positions that you take motivated by this overall thesis.
Yeah.
And you feel free to add any that I've missed.
Sure.
So again, the thesis is you're in this competition, you're trying to distinguish yourself from the computer, and you generally learn about the different ways that you are generally different from the computers and to emphasize those, and then you take that as a lesson for life that you should try to be those ways outside of this competition, that you should, in the rest of your life, continue to try to do the sorts of things that in this competition would differentiate you from these machines.
Mm-hmm.
So, particular, you then celebrate a conversation. You dislike conversations that dodge or lighten the mood or change subjects, the sort of things, the tricks the computers might be trying to do.
Right.
You dislike customer service systems where you don't deal with just one person, but you deal with a bunch of different people in fragmented ways who are each following scripts instead of having a lot of discretion. You don't like, for example, the fact that in arguments people become stateless, and so that they just cut hot and bothered. So you say you contemptuously are unwilling to act like a bot. You want to choose to have more state in your conversation. You don't, for example, like rational choice economics, which doesn't focus as much on economics. You think it's bad to have tanning salons at the beach or exercise gyms rather than walking. You don't like jobs where people aren't fully intellectually challenged. You don't like micromanagement or following manuals or procedures on the jobs. You celebrate an architect who refuses to scale his practice in order to serve more customers so that he can continue to be very adaptive to each customer fully. You don't like the language of salesmen, seducers, and politicians, which is often very structured and cautious and careful to avoid various things. You don't like actors who don't change their performances enough from night to night. You especially like actors who rehearsed all their characters separately and then showed up on stage for one grand performance where they met each other and interacted. You don't like playing games out of a book. You like getting to the point of a game where it's harder to predict what's going to happen next. You don't like having games, basically, of any sort where there's a clear metric of success. You'd rather be in a situation where people are choosing their metrics for success. You don't like domains with clear boundaries. You prefer professions like poetry or philosophy where the boundary of the profession is pretty ambiguous and open. You prefer play to work. You prefer interruptions and barging in conversation to taking turns. Focus on curiosity over status. And subjects who won't sit still for painters and real pictures instead of simulated images. So this is a long list of some of the many ways in which your general attitude toward trying not to be mimicked by a computer drives you to prefer some things and others in life. So I'm trying to make it clear that this has a lot of implications, and you're drawing a lot of implications out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that emphasizes the question, well, yes, but why should we care so much whether we could be mimicked by a computer or not? Why don't we just choose whether or not to take turns in conversations based on how that makes our conversations go for some other reason? It's not so much about acting natural, just as having other reasons than trying to win this contest.
Yes. I mean, I think part of it is that the value in the sorts of things that I talk about in the book, like stateful conversations that build this sort of long, accrued context as they go along, or conversations that get out of book, where you find yourself really searching for a way to articulate what you believe rather than, offering this pre-constructed soundbite, that sort of thing. To some extent, I am willing to argue that there's like an a priori value in those things because they're hard-form machines. But part of it also is that I think we simply intuitively find those experiences more pleasurable, more fun. That, in the mid-20th century, George Orwell is writing about politicians and says, when you see the tired hack on the stump repeating the familiar phrases, you get the sense that you're not looking at a live organism, you're looking at some sort of machine. And I think that's something that we feel even without, the structure of this argument about the Turing test in particular, that I certainly recognized a lot of moments in my life as I looked at the Turing test transcripts. I recognized situations where I've sat down to try to catch up with an old friend and sort of struggled to find the means of doing so. You sit down and you say, so, how's it going? What's been going on? And they say, oh, nothing much, and there's a kind of struggle, I think, to figure out how to break that ice. And so what I think, part of why I get really invested in things like chatbots is that I think they give us, they give us metaphors, these very sort of concrete, quantitative metaphors, for doing what we intrinsically want to do. In these situations, we want to try to get out of book. And knowing that it's like this process that's called getting out of book helps us kind of understand what we're going through and what the strategy is. I mean, did you sort of have that feeling of recognizing like certain situations in life?
So I can certainly recognize that many of the pairs you identify, the item in the pair that you favor is one that many people favor. It often is a high-status item. It's often an item that's considered more impressive. It's considered more respectable. It's more enviable. Mm-hmm. But I guess I would want to think about the causal origins of those feelings and where they come from, and then in the context of having a sense of that origin, then wonder how much I want to embrace them.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So, for example, one of the urges that you identify in the book is this idea that we want to be unique, and we want to distinguish ourselves. So we want to have some sense of what makes humans different. Yeah. And so we can put our finger on it and keep that difference there. Mm-hmm. And you talk about how, in general, most firms in our economy emphasize having a specialized and different product. That's one of the main focuses in marketing, is to try to get yourself a unique product. Now, I teach graduate industrial organization, and that's also works out in standard academic models. Mm-hmm. But the primary reason in the models for firms wanting to be different is so that they have more market power, so that they can raise prices and have a profit to cover fixed costs. Yeah. Which is often at the cost of the customers who end up paying more. Now that can promote more innovation when the different firms focus on their different products, and then they have an incentive to innovate those products, whereas otherwise they might be too afraid that other people would copy their innovations. But it's not obvious that the general urge to be unique and differentiate yourself is such a laudable goal. Mm-hmm. It's an understandable goal, and for example, in our distant ancestors and forager tribes, it appears that the tribes are bigger, the groups are bigger than they otherwise would need to be, and people are more specialized than they otherwise would need to be, in part so that they can each feel like everybody needs them and that they have a secure position. Yeah. But that's understandable, but it's not something to celebrate necessarily.
Perhaps not. I mean, I'm trying to think. If there are situations, for example, I intrinsically enjoy playing chess, even though I know that I am far worse than my phone. The phone that I'm talking to you on is, orders of magnitude better than I am at chess. But there's something fun about it all the same, And so I'm not totally willing to say I'm never going to play chess again, because now I know that there are algorithms that can encode that thought process fairly rigidly and surpass the more sort of intuitive, flexible human approach. I think there's something to what you're saying in that, like, it wouldn't be appropriate to just across the board say, we should be completely reactionary to whatever computers can do and, like, immediately sort of back down. But I think at the same time there's something, I guess part of what I'm really invested in is that I see there being a kind of a useful corrective in that approach to what I think of as being overly reactionary to differentiating us from animals. So Descartes in particular, but a number of the Greek philosophers as well, are sort of shockingly condescending about what it is that animals can do. Like wolves can navigate through the jungle, they can stalk their prey, they can make friends and make enemies, they can, communicate in this rudimentary way. And, these philosophers basically come in and say, well, that's just, they're just big bags of meat, like, that's really not that impressive. We, humans, have this amazing ability to do math and remember facts and stuff like that.
Right. So this general tendency to identify us versus them and to load praise on us and heap criticism on them is, true not only across, these very broad categories you're talking about, like man versus machine or humans versus animals. It also applies within professions, across nations, across genders even.
Yeah.
Clearly, people have been told, males have been told to act like a man and don't act like a woman. Civilized people have been told to act civilized.
Mm-hmm.
And they've distorted, in some sense, behavior by trying to make sure people emphasized how they were different from these other threats to their dominance, I guess. But shouldn't we just reject all of them and find other reasons for doing things? And if what we do ends up being a lot like an animal, we say, fine, it's like an animal. Animals have good things, then we're like a good thing. Or if what we end up doing is like something they do in a developing country, we say, well, okay, people in developing countries they're human, and they have some good human elements, and it's all right if we're like them. So why not also with machines and say, well, this is a laudable feature, and a machine has the feature, but that doesn't make it any less laudable. Let's continue to do whatever is laudable and not just focus on differentiating ourselves from other things.
I would imagine, like, in the long term, that's completely appropriate. I mean, I think to some extent, I'm willing to take maybe a slightly more hyperbolic position than I otherwise might, because I feel to some extent that I'm introducing this argument into a society that's leaning too far the other way. That, for example, we go to the gym and work out in order to be healthy, in order to, like, acquire health, rather than thinking that running and leaping are health. Do you know what I mean? Like, we treat these things in its very goal-oriented way rather than seeing them as part of the human experience. So it's like I'll eat healthy and exercise so that I can be more productive at work, which consists in, manipulating numbers on a glowing screen as if I were this kind of floating brain. To me, that's dangerous, and part of what I find very exciting about the history of artificial intelligence is that it's it's been showing us, contrary to what Descartes, et cetera, would have had us believe, that a lot of these skills, like organizing our orientation in space, moving our muscles around, recognizing people and objects, and exchanging messages, that there is a real cognitive richness to that. There's sort of this, the stereotype of the dumb jock. The math team has a certain sense of contempt for the soccer team. And part of what I think is useful is that if you think about it in the context of trying to develop an AI system that's bipedal and that somehow maintains its balance while running across a field and kicking a ball, that would be a humongous challenge. You'd need a lot of computing power behind that. The Segway has 3 computers in it just to keep the handlebars upright. So I think to some extent, AI gives us an ability to, maybe equalize, maybe get rid of some of these prejudices against certain human activities as being more, human, if you will, than others. So
I think we should bring in the context here of the historical origins of these various things that were held high and things that were held low, because you bring them in as if they were just sort of philosophical presumptions that floated in from on high or something, but there's a very real history that I presume you'll acknowledge, which is at the broadest level that humans a million years ago were lived in very small bands and had relatively little specialization and relatively little long-term investment or things like that. And say with the introduction of farming and then later with industry, humans required a lot more coordination and structure, and we had strong social norms introduced to get people to follow that structure, to be married, to be loyal to their tribe for war, to save their seed corn and stay in one place and do all these things. And we ended up, celebrating the psychological tendencies that enabled those things, loyalty and perseverance and et cetera, that sort of thing. And then with the introduction of industry, we again had great specialization, structured work, structured practices, ranking, sorting, giving of instructions, and we ended up in some way celebrating the capabilities that enabled industry. And in many of those things are what you are complaining about. That you,
yes.
But in some sense, there's this natural human resistance or dislike for being made to do things that weren't natural. So our forager lifestyle was very natural, and then we have to have become unnatural in order to become farmers and then industrialists.
Right.
And but much of our wealth is because of that. So there certainly is a trade-off we each face between doing what feels natural and doing what will get us paid and keep us functioning in the society.
Yep.
And often the people who can most afford to do what's natural are the richest, and so being able to get away with doing what feels natural is often a signal of wealth.
Right.
And that shows up in terms of what kind of jobs you can manage and what kind of art you can do and things like that. Obviously, the artist who can ignore the industrial constraints and the financial constraints and just do what they feel like is a high-status artist. And the ones who can get away with that are the ones often with the best abilities. And so it does end up being correlated with ability, and it is a signal of ability, and it is impressive then.
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, this to me is actually one of the things that I'm sure you'll be able to tell me more about this, but that I find somewhat paradoxical about economics, that we can simultaneously look at a society like, Victorian England or something, and say, isn't it amazing that they kind of lifted themselves out of this agrarian lifestyle, and now we have this monarchy that can eat really excellent roast beef all the time and have silk tapestries and stuff. But if you look at the leisure of that aristocratic class, it consists in maintaining gardens and going hunting, which is precisely the lifestyle that this culture has worked so hard to get out of. Now it's like what they aspire to do with their free time.
Right. Absolutely.
To me, that's one of the strange things, and it makes a word like poverty really complicated, where the person making, let's say, $7,000 a year or something, living in an American urban setting, is experiencing poverty. But the person making that same amount of money, living in like a dirt hut on a prairie or something like that, where they're farming stuff in their backyard and maybe hunting animals occasionally or fishing or something. When you ask a question like, who's got the better standard of living, it's not necessarily clear that we've accomplished all that much through this process of industrializing. If we are in these bodies that were sort of made to hang out on prairies and go for long walks and fish and do these sorts of things, I'm not saying it's quite that simple, but do you feel like, is there a sort of a tension about this in economics?
Well, it's clear that with civilization and with industry, we've gained many things, but they've come at a real cost.
Okay.
And so there should be no denying the real costs of all the gains. And in the end, whether the gains are worth the costs, to an economist is judged by the individual people and the choices they make. If they're given an option to move back toward the older ways, do they choose to do so or not? Mm-hmm. And if people in the older ways are given a choice to come to the newer ways, do they choose? And by our continued actions, we're making these choices, trade-offs. We are choosing, for example, our tolerance for structure on the job, our tolerance for how much we're going to be routinized and botized, if you like, on the job for the returns we get from that job and how much that enables our life of leisure afterwards.
Yeah.
And many of the critiques you make are critiques. They're about the costs people are paying, but they seem to be knowingly paying those costs to get other benefits. And I'm reluctant to tell them they're wrong. Are you?
Well, I think I don't necessarily know that they are wrong, but I think that it serves us well to be really aware at as subtle a level as possible where the costs are being made and what the costs are. That I think, I use the example in the book of these call center operators, that one of the things that we're dealing with in our society right now is that a lot of customer service is literally being taken over by AI software running on computers. But a lot of customer service is also being taken over by AI software running on people, effectively.
Right.
And the existence of something like a chatbot that one of these people can point to and say, I could take a class in some sort of scripting language and in about 6 weeks create something that's going to do everything that I'm doing. That knowledge, I think, affects one's sense of the job. I have people, friends of mine, have come up to me and said, can you teach me a scripting language? Because I really think that I can automate about half my job, And I think there's this slightly more economic or political question of what do we do with the time that person saves? Like if we're paying someone by the hour, then maybe they're not really incentivized to create the AI program that's going to make their job take half as long. And my argument sort of drops off around that point because I think those are market questions, they're political questions, but it does strike me that there's something productive in being aware of what things you're doing are and aren't taking advantage of your full range of abilities. So I think the more that we come to understand about ourselves, the more we can put our finger on that we have these hunches. I'm not saying that the argument completely changes our intuitions, but it allows us to kind of put our finger on these sorts of things and say, yeah, no, here's what's wrong with this interaction. Here's what's wrong with this job.
So I fear that it's not. It's sort of bringing in an unfair or illicit consideration in what should be the weighing of other more licit or appropriate considerations. So firms decide what kind of customer service to offer based on trade-offs between cost and profit and performance and customer satisfaction, and customers will choose which products to buy based in part on their expectations about the quality of customer service and the process involved. Mm-hmm. And the employees will choose which sorts of jobs to take, including whether to be customer service representatives in different firms based in part on how routinized or structured the job is and how much they enjoy or don't enjoy that job. Those are all perfectly legitimate considerations that go into weighing, and it could well be that in the next 10 years we'll find that people just really hate this kind of customer service and it'll go away, or it could turn out that in fact customers would rather suffer through this sort of customer service and actually pay more for the products or right, get more help. Yeah. We don't know the answer to those questions, but it seems to me that you coming in and saying, and you should be ashamed of yourself for acting like a robot, is just to bring in a whole other status consideration that, tips the tables in a somewhat illegitimate way. Why should they feel ashamed of themselves for taking a job that pays decent wage, that provides service that somebody wants, just because they're acting more like a robot?
I mean, I'm trying to think. I don't know. I mean, I think the fact that if I were in a software job, for example, it would be really useful for me to know what tools existed. I mean, I think that's part of it, is if you've got a guy whose job is to, hammer nails into the ground with a rock, and then you say, oh, well, have you heard they've invented a hammer? That part of what I think is useful about that is that he can get a hammer and use it. And so, a lot of my friends that work in software are constantly automating portions of their job.
Right. As well they should. But yeah. I don't really see you as the Johnny Appleseed of software toolkits here. That's not the role you've chosen for yourself. You didn't write a book about, here's how you could automate your job, and here's some tools, and here's some of the common ways that you could do that, and some of the pitfalls, etc. You instead come out with a grand sort of image of what we should celebrate in ourselves and what we should be ashamed of, to say, well, we should celebrate things in ourselves that are hard to mimic with computers, and we should be ashamed of ourselves for doing things that are relatively easy for computers to do.
Well, I don't know if shame is necessarily the word, but I think, I think if you have someone whose job it is to field these calls in a really rigid, mechanical way, where they're basically sort of running chatbot software on their own mind, I think it's maybe too much for me to say in the abstract, should they quit their job, should they demand a raise, should they demand that they get to learn how to program a bot to do their job. I don't really know what's the appropriate reaction there, but I do think that it's useful for them to come home at the end of the day and know exactly what it is that they are missing during their 9 to 5 and how to get that when they sit down at the dinner table with their family. That if we have this notion of conversation as following the paths of etiquette and quote-unquote saying the right things in a sort of objective sense, it's going to lead us, I think, in the wrong direction. So, one of the stories that the book tells is of these sort of wannabe pickup artists who are assembling this massive, database, if you will, of here's what I say, and then if she says this, I know to say that, and if she says this, I know to say this other thing. That part of what I want to argue in the book is that maybe that is a legitimate way to do, business, like totally fungible business. But it is a totally misguided approach at living life. And I think you don't have to take my word for it, right? Like you can try both and see what you think but it's useful to, I don't know, to have this kind of background process in your mind running that's saying, wait a minute, I appear to be responding mechanically here. Let me see if I can focus on what is unique and distinctive about this situation and sort of latch onto that rather than just drawing on my, memory.
But why shouldn't I be focused on whether I'm getting what I want out of the process rather than whether it's mechanical? If what I want out of the process I can get by being mechanical, why shouldn't I do that? Why should I hesitate because it's mechanical? Turn it around, and again, computers were made by humans. None of the other animals came close, and much of the industrial world's mechanical processes and methods and procedures are the development of people, and they are many of our crowning triumphs of humanity. We are creatures who have become something different than our ancestors were. We've developed big, powerful, civilized world based in substantial part on our ability to create and then follow structure, process that is not as natural for a forager, which doesn't in any one case express the full range of our human capacities, but that's part of the price we pay for a rich, powerful world. If you want a date, and if following some scripts actually gets you the dates you want, and the people you're dating like it too because they keep dating you, then I don't see why I should complain about that or try to make them feel ashamed of themselves because they're following a script. I would more ask, is it getting you what you wanted out of this process? If in fact following the scripts doesn't work, then that's the reason to stop doing it. The same way for the salesmen and the politicians, etc. The reason salesmen follow salesman scripts is that it sells.
Yes. I think there's something ethically dicey about getting to this point where, you're going on a date with someone and you're only thinking of how can I say the thing to get me what I want. This completely teleological.
You're okay with that in sales, right? You're okay with that for a salesman or a politician? I mean, how is it really different?
I find it creepy. There's something that I find slightly detestable about, getting sales calls and about getting, solicited politically. That to me sort of falls into that same thing of, I'm clearly just a means to some sort of end that this person wants. And I think it bears it out that if Neil Strauss's famous chronicle of the underground world of these pickup artists kind of trading their lines back and forth, what he ultimately finds is that they're basically miserable. They feel like they don't have any actual relationships. They don't feel like they have any actual friendships with each other. And
you also quote Glenn Ross, who was making a similar argument about the salesman.
Yeah, that's right. So maybe chatbot softwares can operate as a kind of cautionary tale in some sense that you don't have to spend 3 years interacting with people this way and then realize that your life is totally empty. You can have this kind of warning light going off in your head that's saying, whoa, I'm botting now, and save yourself the 3-year-long downward spiral,
So let me suggest that often this sort of nuanced, detailed, subtle response is a standard signal of intelligence and perception, and that we are often quite eager to show that we can distinguish things that other people can't because they signal our better ability. So, for example, a salesman has to target their pitch to the typical audience that they're selling to. If their audience isn't paying very much attention or isn't very intelligent or isn't especially motivated by, certain subtle things, then the salesman's approach can be very crude and straightforward and be good enough for that context. If the salesman is dealing with a much more subtle or discriminating audience, then the salesman has to make a much subtler and discriminating pitch.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's right.
partly we distinguish ourselves by trying to show that we are subtle and discriminating in order to convince people that we are more intelligent and richer, etc. And so there's just a status game in trying to say that sure, that sales pitch works for an ordinary customer, but it doesn't work for me because I just find that all too crude and simple-minded. Mm-hmm. And that works in dating as well as in, automobiles or political candidates. And this isn't about robots versus people at all. It's about sort of the usual status hierarchy of showing off that you can make finer distinctions than other people can.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it also is that, I mean, this is maybe opening a kettle of fish that I don't know if we have time to fully get into, but, a lot of the scenarios that you describe are scenarios in which there's an extremely clear objective. And so one of the chapters in the book, of course, it looks at the difference between systems where there's an extremely clear objective and systems where there's not a clear objective. So, one of the anecdotes that the book brings up is the game SimCity, where Will Wright, the creator of SimCity, is really interested in developing this game where you just sort of play around. And Broderbund, the software company, says to him, well, this is an interesting idea, let's do some work and turn it into a game. And Will Wright says, well, what do you mean it is a game? And part of what they mean is we need to give it an objective. Right. We need to say to the player, you have one sim year to create a sim city of population 1 million, go. And if you do that, you win. If you don't do that, you lose.
Right. Yep.
Part of the beauty of these games is that there's no point. You play to sort of explore the possibilities of the game. And, a recent example would be a game like Minecraft, where it's one of the most popular and successful games of the past 12 months, but there's no point. There's no, you can't
and I'm sure the makers of these games are happy to celebrate that you enjoy these experiences and you enjoy the fact that they don't have a clear goal, and that's something you like. But I don't know why you should necessarily denigrate all the other people who like games where there's a clear scoring. Imply they're really not human, in fact. It's somehow less human to like a game where there's a clear score, like, say, basketball. To speak of a random game in the current era.
I guess part of what I want to argue is that, one of the intrinsically human things is, unlike a computer where, you take a chess computer and you say to the chess computer, you need to go for checkmate. That's the goal. You must do that. It can then figure out the relative merits of everything else. It can tell you that the queen is worth about 9 times what the pawn is worth, and all these things. Part of what I think of as one of the intrinsically human qualities, and to some limited extent I want to side with Sartre here, is that we have to decide what we care about. And so part of what's interesting to me about video games is that video games typically provide you a very structured environment where it's extremely clear what to care about. There's some point value, and you just intrinsically want to make that number go up.
And that's very human too, isn't it?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think we latch on to these situations. I mean, to take a sort of existentialist position, I would say, there's the anxiety of freedom, which is what the existentialists are always talking about. And that part of why we get really addicted to video games, especially in our moments of procrastination, is that they temporarily relieve us of the anxiety of needing to choose our goals by giving us an extremely clear goal structure.
And you disapprove. But don't you need an argument other than it's easier for us machines to mimic that, or easier for machines to handle that task, than as an argument for why that's bad or why people should be avoiding that?
I guess my argument to some degree is there is some... I guess I put it this way. If let's say you're talking to someone and you're trying to sell them the vacuum cleaner, or you're trying to get them to go out with you or something. And everything's going really well, but at the end, for some reason, they don't buy the vacuum cleaner. Well, if you're operating in this really teleological way, you'll say, damn it, I just wasted 2 hours of my life.
Right.
Because the entire 2 hours was in the service of this goal. You didn't hit the goal, and so you got nothing out of it.
Right.
And I think that can be really dangerous, because you can imagine someone whose life goal it is to...
right. Well, you're saying it's dangerous to want something because you might not get it, right? I mean, in general. Be the Buddha instead, right? If you don't want, you can't be disappointed.
Yes, and this is getting into some deep level metaphysics, but I think my beef, if I can say this with Buddhism, is that I think part of the human experience is desire, so that it's not. I'm not willing to go all the way down the sort of Buddhist track of saying we should try not to want anything, but that part of what I think is this human thing, not of being given a goal and having to pursue it, but in choosing the goal, is that even if I don't sell the vacuum cleaner, it's worth remembering that it was my decision to want to sell the vacuum cleaner, that I chose to play that game. I chose to train for the Olympics even if I didn't make the team.
Right. And so later on, if you don't do well, you can say, I didn't want to do that anyway. Ha.
You can. I mean, yes, you can. Or you can sort of savor the fact that, it feels good to care about hockey, even though I lost the game. That it's part of, Aristotle's obsessed with why do we watch sad plays? And part of what he gets into is, well, it feels good to care about things. And sadness is a way of reminding yourself that you care about something. So, I don't know. That to me is part of it. Is that I think ethics. I think ethics are a big part of this. That to some degree, I want to say that the computer system is not ethically responsible in the way that a person is, because systems, at least as they exist now, do not have to make choices about what to value. So if I'm the vacuum salesman,
they don't now, because we don't like to make machines like that.
I'm not saying they never could. I'm saying under the current paradigm of the way they're programmed, the way they're built.
Sure.
That if I'm the vacuum salesman, maybe I'll be willing to pretend I'm slightly more left or right leaning politically to appeal to the person I'm talking to. Am I willing to, spill a glass of wine all over their furniture just to show them that I can vacuum it up? So you start to get to a point, and this is ethics to my mind. Ethics is deciding what value is more important. And yeah.
We just have a few minutes left here, and I wanted to touch on sort of the future speculation part of your book. Your book isn't really about it, and you don't touch on it that much, but you do mention this idea. For example, on page 64, you talk about that Kurzweil speaks of a utopian future where we shed our bodies and upload our minds into computers and live forever, virtual, immortal, and disembodied, heaven for hackers. And you're contrasting that with a body-centered way of living.
Yeah.
And that particular vision imagines people have virtual bodies, and that the uploaded minds in computers then interact with their, simulated bodies, or they could have android bodies.
Yeah.
And then in both of those ways, they would still have a rather body-centered lifestyle. But the more important point, though, is just that with those kinds of machines, they would share all of the kinds of values that you now share about the relative importance of method versus spontaneity, or choosing your own goals and barging in a conversation, etc. The kinds of machines that you are objecting to are mainly the kinds of machines that we explicitly construct out of our explicit plans to make methods and things like that.
Yeah, that's
because
right.
these other kinds of machines would be our more direct mental descendants, and they would inherit our uh, usual mental sort of preferences for, these sorts of the things that you celebrate in your book.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the book is mostly about AI from a perspective of, negative 2,600 years to plus 20 years. But I do, briefly touch on some of these questions of what is the, plus 50 years future looking like. And absolutely, I mean, I would say I don't happen to be the kind of person who thinks that there's something intrinsically sacred about the neuron or the DNA molecule or something like that. So if you could faithfully represent the workings of the human brain in all of its complexity using, silicon or ammonia or what have you, if it's operating in a completely analogous way, I don't really have a problem with that.
So,
Yeah.
right, even with them though, there's going to be this trade-off between styles of living and styles of thinking that sort of are the most like our distant ancestors had, and styles of thinking that have been adapted to the modern industrial, capitalist, etc. world. And there will still be some feeling of unnaturalness to these adapted approaches. And it sounds like you, in general, want to celebrate the more traditional ways in which we felt about things.
Well,
So,
I think it's not necessarily tradition for tradition's sake. That part of it is unlike what the existentialists would argue. We are not simply this disembodied bundle of thoughts that sort of pops into existence and can really do anything. That we are put into this, piece of meat that is a certain size. It has the ability to sense certain things in certain ways, but not other things in other ways. It lives at a certain time scale where certain things in the universe happen so fast that we don't really care, or we can't really understand them. Certain things happen so slowly we can't really understand them. And so, the danger that I see for something like uploading your consciousness onto the internet it's really the same thing that makes me uneasy when I think of Descartes imagining himself as this brain in a vat, which is that...
But if we imagine these things as embodied, for example, let's imagine one of these uploads has a body that's a centimeter tall.
Yeah.
It's a tiny body. Now, it will have different time scales, it will have different spatial scales, and then it would adapt its experiences and attitudes to those different scales. You're not going to complain about the fact that it no longer adapts to things on a meter scale or a second scale because it's now a different body, right? As long as it's adapted to its new body, it's all right if it ventures out into new territory of how it thinks about things.
Well, and I think that's completely fine. And that's part of why I personally find animals and insects and things like that so fascinating, is because they represent like a different embodied experience. So I don't have any problem with someone saying I want to be 1 centimeter tall and see what that's like. I think the point that I'm more invested in making is that it's useful to remember that consciousness is not simply this disembodied logic, but it's about the lived experience. And so the embodiment gives rise to a certain kind of consciousness. You could argue that the fact that our bodies are symmetrical gives rise to expressions like on the one hand versus on the other hand. So people have gone so far as to argue that the way that we structure rhetoric is representative of our own body.
But so a lot of the contrasts you make between sort of the way it feels natural and that you respect that humans can act and the way they could act more like machines, these are based on sort of the way our minds are now. But in a future where these minds can just become an enormous range of different possibilities, I'm not sure I would want to push them more to be like we are now than, say, like our machines are now, per se.
No, I don't think they would have to be. I think what would interest me about that scenario is it's the same thing that interests me about AI in general, which is that we're at a point right now where it's sort of hard for us to distinguish between general intelligence and intelligence as it relates to being a human being, because we don't really have other examples that allow us to kind of disambiguate that. So if we have this fully Turing test passingly articulate guy who's 1 centimeter tall and lives at a totally different time scale or something like that, the existence of that creature or thing is going to allow us to see, I think, with a greater degree of clarity what it is to be a human being in a human body. And so I guess that to me is what's useful and interesting about it. And the danger that I see with people like Kurzweil and these people who imagine themselves kind of uploading their mind into a computer network, whatever that would mean, I don't think that there's anything like evil necessarily about doing it, but I think the mistake is in thinking that you can directly translate from one experience to the other. That I think part of what's interesting about the human experience is that it's an embodied experience, and so when you switch the body, you're going to switch the experience. And so, in doing so,
as we said at the beginning,
yeah.
you know, the fact that we have these computers now helps us see more clearly what we are compared
Absolutely.
to them, because they're a closer comparison. But once we see more clearly what we are, I think that says less about what we should become than I read your book as saying. I would still think there's a choice whether we want to become more like the computers or want to make sure that we don't become like them. I think that choice should be made based on what we get out of it. In many ways, it's okay to become more routinized if we get a lot out of it.
I think to some extent I'm comfortable saying, like, viva la différence. That, part of what I think is really exciting to me is what AI is teaching us. And then, to some extent, I think you're right, that it's up to us to do what we will with that information, which, is in itself this very human thing of trying to decide what your value system is and what matters.
And that may mean we eventually become no longer human.
Time will tell. Yeah.
It's been fun talking with you, Brian.
Yeah, likewise.
Good luck with the rest of your book tour.
Yeah, thanks.
And maybe this will be remembered as your strangest interview.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.